Hi, class. Welcome. It's Dr. Lindner. What we're going to be talking about in this video is going to be the introduction to anatomy and physiology. So, we're going to be talking about different disciplines of anatomy and physiology. We'll talk about the organization of the human body. We'll talk about the properties of living things, and we'll also talk about the concept of homeostasis. So, what is A&P? What's anatomy and physiology? So, when we look at anatomy, anatomy is the science of structure. When we look at physiology, physiology is the science of function. So, you may have heard of the principle structure determines function. And that is true. Structure helps to determine function. If you look at the shoulder joint and the way the shoulder moves in so many different directions, that's different than an elbow joint. So the structure of the elbow and the structure of the shoulder being different determines how they function differently. Some anatomy books are called form and function, but everything has structure. Not just the muscles, not just the skeleton, but even the cell has a structure. The cell membrane has a structure. When we learn about chemistry, the structure of a protein is different than the structure of a carbohydrate. It's different than the structure of a fat. And the structure of them are different, which means they all behave differently in the human body. And we can look at structure in so many different ways, right? Maybe we do a dissection. Maybe we do an x-ray, maybe an MRI or a CAT scan. These are all ways of analyzing the structure, looking at it under a microscope, okay? So in your lab, that's what you're going to be doing a whole lot of, looking at structure. When we look at some of the different branches of anatomy, well, there's embryology, there's developmental biology, there's cell biology. We're going to focus a little bit on cell biology right here. We're going to talk about the cellular structure and functions. We're going to talk about all the different organelles and what they do. And when cells come together, cells make tissues. So we'll talk a little bit about histology. Histology is the study of the tissues, and there are four different types of tissues. The four different types of tissues are going to be epithelium, connective tissue, connective tissue. The third is muscle. And the fourth is nerve. So we'll talk about the four tissues, the four types of tissues being epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. And this is going to take about 2 weeks for us to go through, maybe a week and a half to 2 weeks to go through that information. So cells come together and make tissues. There's gross anatomy. Gross anatomy is anything that can be examined with the naked eye. Okay. Systemic anatomy, this is looking at the 11 systems, like the digestive system, the respiratory system, the endocrine system. I'll go through the systems and some of the main parts of these systems, some of which we'll do in A&P1 and other ones we'll do in A&P2. Then there's regional anatomy. Maybe you have someone who's a specialist that just deals with the shoulder, or they only deal with hips. That's the regional anatomy. And then surface anatomy, this is really important for like phlebotomists or for acupuncturists. They have to really be able to understand the surface markings of the body on the outside. And they should be able to see them and be able to palpate those landmarks. But again, they're really just on the surface. And then there's imaging anatomy. And that, of course, requires diagnostic imaging, X-rays, MRIs, CAT scans, to be able to examine what's happening inside the human body. And this is all kind of normal anatomy. But pathological anatomy, this is like pathophysiology. This is looking at anything outside of the norm, right? That's pathology or the diseases. Okay. In terms of physiology, well, we're going to talk about um, molecular physiology very superficially. When we talk about organic and inorganic chemistry, we'll discuss a little bit of that. When we get into the nervous system, we'll get into neurophysiology. Endocrinology is ANP2, cardiovascular is ANP2, immunology is ANP2, respiratory, lungs is ANP2, renal is ANP2. So most of these are going to be anatomy and physiology too, except for neurophysiology and a little bit of molecular physiology. When we talk about levels of structural organization, what is it that makes up a human body? Well, it starts off with the smallest part, number one, which is the chemical level. Okay, the chemical level. So this is, when we talk about chemicals, I think of biochemicals or biochemistry. We think of proteins, carbs, and fats. That's why nutrition is so important. But when we look at proteins and we look at carbs and we look at fats, these things are just made up of carbohydrates, hydrogens, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphates. So we have several elements that make up proteins, carbs, and fats. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. That makes up about 96% of the human body are just those four elements right there. And phosphorus is also important. So what we see here is DNA. But when we think of DNA, we refer to it as a double helix, which is what? It's a structure. And the structure determines function even at the chemical level. When your chemicals come together, they make cells. Chemicals come together and make the cell. In this particular case, this happens to be a smooth muscle cell, just one of them. But when you have a bunch of cells that come together, they're going to make tissues, right? These are a bunch of smooth muscle cells that are going to make smooth muscle tissue. Remember, that's one of the four types of tissues. We said that there's epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nerve tissue. Now, when tissues come together to then make organs. In this particular case, we're looking at the stomach. And you can see that the stomach is made up of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, right? It's made up of three of the four tissues. When organs come together, organs make up systems. This is one of the 11 systems. This is the digestive system. Right? Talking about the mouth, the teeth, the tongue, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, liver, pancreas, gallbladder. All of these parts work synergistically to break down and metabolize or catabolize our foods. The digestive system is one system, but you also have the muscular system, the skeletal system, reproductive system, the neural system, the immune system. So there's 11 different systems that I'll get into. And when all those systems come together, it creates the crowning creation of all, the organism. Okay, so I'd make sure that I know this, I know the order of this. from smallest to largest or largest to smallest. You may end up seeing that on the test a little bit. Now, when we can see things with the naked eye, that's great. But when we can't, then we need the help of a microscope. So the microscope is going to help us deal with cells and tissues, things that we can't see with the naked eye. And when we study the cells, that's cytology. When we study the tissues, that is histology. So cytology, whenever you see that, C-Y-T, you'll see it in several words like osteocyte, or you'll see it in hepatocyte, right? Osteo is bone, so osteocyte is a bone cell. Hepa, like hepatitis, that's liver, so hepatocyte is a liver cell. So whenever you see that, it's always linking it to the cell, okay? Now, when a group of cells come together, they make tissues. When we study the tissues, that's histology. The person who studies the tissues, that individual is called a histologist. A histologist is going to examine the tissues, like from biopsy. So when a woman goes to the gynecologist and a woman goes for a pap smear, that's going to be sent to a histologist. They're sloughing off the cells and tissues of the vaginal area or the tip of the cervix, and they're looking at structure. They're looking at the structure of those cells. Is it normal or abnormal? And pap from pap smear comes from the physician or the histologist that discovered the procedure, a Greek by the name of George Papanakilou. So they abbreviated his name, they call it a pap smear. Okay? At the organ level, that's where we cross the boundary from being microscopic to macroscopic. Right? That makes sense. When tissues come together, they're going to make organs. Now you can physically see a stomach or a kidney or a spleen. Now, there are 11 systems of the human body. The integumentary system, which is the skin, hair, and nails, the skeletal system, the muscular system, the nervous system, endocrine, cardiovascular, lymphatic or immune, respiratory, digestive system, urinary, and reproductive. And what we're going to do is just briefly discuss the 11 systems, like have a little bit of a familiarity into these main parts and what they do. So let me stop the video at this point, see if we have any questions.